Following the Israeli war on Gaza, the inauguration of President Obama, and the Israeli elections, I wanted some perspective on the status of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and I thought that Professor Noam Chomsky would be an ideal candidate. But before I share that conversation with you, I'd like to thank Denis Kossayem from the Département de Philosophie, Collège André Laurendeau, for helping me to prepare for this interview. Yes, good morning. Is this Professor Chomsky?
Yeah, speaking.
Firstly, thank you very much for accepting to do this interview.
No, glad to do it.
Do you think that the 29 votes by Livni's Kadima party in the last election were favorably influenced by the war on Gaza? And if so, what does this say about the mood of the Israeli public opinion?
I think Kadima received some more votes than it otherwise would have because the small parties of the left, many of them drained into Kadima just to try to stop Netanyahu and Lieberman, even if they didn't agree. But the basic nature of the election is quite unmistakable. I mean, it's a significant shift towards the jingoist right. And yes, it was influenced by Gaza. The invasion of Gaza, the attack on Gaza, was overwhelmingly supported by Jewish Israelis, maybe 95%. And much of the criticism of it was that it didn't go far enough. They should have totally wiped out the beasts, not just devastated the region. So it's a very significant shift to the right. Avigdor Lieberman, who was regarded as virtually a neo-Nazi not long ago, is now becoming a centrist. In fact, even the New York Times describes his positions in an interesting way as some of his positions as acceptable to the left. It's quite interesting, and in fact, one should keep an eye on it. The Ethan Bronner, the New York Times correspondent, wrote that Lieberman's proposal to yield some land, yield Israeli land to the Palestinians, is a forthcoming proposal that's, that the left would accept, the peace movement. What he didn't bother to tell you is that the yielding the land means is a position that was denounced as viciously racist when it was first proposed, but is now moving to the mainstream, namely the idea, his proposal to take areas of heavy Arab population concentration in the Wadi Ara, where al-Fahim is inside Israel, and simply force people into some kind of derisory Palestinian entity. Of course, you don't ask them. They're all opposed. I mean, that really is an ugly racist proposal, but now it's being described as yielding land to be in a way acceptable to the left. That's a sign of how, apart from the deceit, it's a sign of how the ultra-right jingoist positions are moving toward the center and even being favorably described in the United States.
Well, I mean, one wonders about the motive then for attacking Hamas. Certainly, it wouldn't be to suppress the rocket fire. In the second question that I posed, it was regarding a piece by Norman Finkelstein, who suggests that actually the war was waged because Hamas had given some signs of wanting to negotiate.
Yeah, in fact, they've given very strong signs. Everything you read in the United States, and I suppose in Canada, describes Hamas as Hamas, the group that is dedicated to the destruction of Israel. This morning's newspapers repeat it. What you don't read is Hamas, the group that has long called for a two-state settlement, which the United States and Israel reject. So yes, that's surely part of the reason. I mean, there's a long tradition. In fact, Finkelstein discusses it in the piece you mentioned of Israel acting to try to undercut the threat of negotiations and diplomatic settlement. The most extreme example of that was their invasion of Lebanon in 1982, which was openly described. Here in the West, there's a mythology about how they had to defend the Galilee from PLO attacks, which is total fabrication. but the only conflicts at the northern border were Israel attacking Lebanon in an effort to elicit some kind of PLO response. But it was clearly described in Israel as an effort to undercut the threatening PLO diplomatic offers which threatened Israeli control of the West Bank. And so it would be consistent, and I think it's part of the reason, but I think there's a simpler reason. Israel, with U.S. backing, is moving systematically to take over what it wants in the West Bank. That means, it's been outlined. It's what Olmert called his Convergence program, since expanded. It's basically Sharon's plan to take over the Jordan Valley, anything inside the separation wall, which is actually an annexation wall, with salients cutting across the territory to break it up into cantons and, arbitrarily distributed checkpoints, hundreds of them, to make life unlivable and to control the population. And they're systematically proceeding to do that with U.S. support. Well, they would love to do it without any resistance, of course. Now, in the West Bank, they've succeeded by violence to crush virtually any resistance, but they haven't succeeded in crushing resistance in the other half of Palestine, namely Gaza. So you want to crush that resistance too, and it's natural that the U.S. would support them. This is described in the West as legitimate self-defense. So when John Kerry was the head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, was in Gaza yesterday, he lectured the Gazans on how they must get their leaders to understand that no country would tolerate rockets being fired, so therefore Israel's reaction was legitimate, maybe disproportionate, but legitimate self-defense. He certainly knows that that's not true, and everyone else who says it, if they think for a minute, knows that it's not true, and they don't believe the principle. When Russia attacked Chechnya and half destroyed it, they claimed that it was legitimate self-defense against Chechen terror, which was very severe, much worse than anything the Palestinians do. But nobody accepted that for good reasons, because they had alternatives, namely peaceful alternatives. Stop carrying out the crimes in Chechnya. And Israel also has peaceful alternatives. Stop carrying out the crimes in the occupied territories. Or even narrower than that, just accept the ceasefire for the first time, every one they disrupted. So when there are peaceful alternatives, there is no legitimate right of self-defense by force. So that doesn't exist. And in the West, the issue can barely be discussed, although it's quite obvious. And I think that's the primary reason for the attack on Gaza. Try to stop any form of resistance to the systematic takeover of whatever Israel wants in the occupied territories with U.S. backing.
Well, given these political facts that you're describing, in addition to the facts on the ground, is a two-state solution, is a viable Palestinian state possible? Sure. There's one thing that's required, that the United States drop its rejectionist stance. For over 30 years, the United States has been blocking such a settlement, and Canada and Europe sort of go along. But although they theoretically approve the two-state settlement, if the U.S. would change its stance, and there is no sign of that, unfortunately, Israel would go along by necessity. There would be no need to force the settlers out of the West Bank. No civil war, nothing else. They simply announce that on such and such a day, the Israeli army returns to Israel, at which point the 90% of the settlers will happily get into the trucks provided for them and move from their subsidized homes in the West Bank to subsidized homes in Israel. And if there's a group of nationalist religious extremists, most of them from Brooklyn, who want to stay, okay, they can stay under Palestinian authority. No violence, nothing. There can be
a legitimate land swap, not the kind that Lieberman is talking about, not the kind that the New York Times approves, but a legitimate one. And in fact, such a proposal, such a solution was almost achieved not very long ago. There's been 1 week in the last 30 years when the U.S. Dropped its rejectionist stance, namely in Taba, Egypt, in the last month of Clinton's term, January 2001, when Israeli and Palestinian negotiators came very close to a settlement. In fact, they said in their last press conference that with a little more time they could have reached it. But Prime Minister Barak of Israel prematurely called off the negotiations, and that disappeared, and nothing's been pursued since. It's important to stress that Obama has made it very clear that he opposes a two-state settlement. There's a lot of illusions about Obama, but just look at what he says. He's a thoughtful, careful person. I'm sure he selects his words carefully. His first foreign policy declaration happened to be on Israel-Palestine. It was the announcement of George Mitchell's appointment as mediator. And he stressed, as always, that our prime concern is the security of Israel. But he said there are some constructive steps, proposals on the Arab side. And he mentioned the Arab League peace proposal, so-called Saudi plan. And he said he thought that had constructive elements, and he urged the Arabs to follow up on the proposal there for normalization of relations with Israel. Now, he carefully excluded, consciously, surely, the core of the plan, namely a two-state settlement in accord with the international consensus. That's the precondition for normalizing relations. Well, when Obama omitted that and called just for normalization of relations, he's saying loud and clear that the United States is going to, under his administration, is going to continue to block the possibility of a diplomatic settlement. And every other action taken so far conforms to that. But that's not graven in stone. That can change.
But there are many Palestinians. I mean, I spoke to Dr. Iyad El-Sarraj while during the bombing in Gaza, and he's not a supporter of the two-state solution. He had some interesting comments where he basically suggested that the psychology of the Israeli state is such that a two-state solution is not feasible. And also, you yourself suggest that there's not much motion in the United States towards any change in policy. So,
well, I've always, all my life, I've opposed a two-state settlement. I think there ought to be a single binational state. But there's a difference between proposal and advocacy. I mean, we can propose that everyone should live in peace. Okay, nice. It becomes advocacy when you describe a means to get from here to there. Now, in the case of a binational state, there was a time when it was directly feasible, 1967 to 1975. And at that time, I wrote and spoke about it quite a lot, a book and many articles. But it was just greeted with hysteria on all sides. PLO didn't want it. Israel didn't want it. The Jewish community hated it. Everyone hated it. But it was feasible then. Today, it isn't. The only form of advocacy that I know of for a binational state, what's sometimes called a one-state solution, is in stages. The first of which would be a two-state settlement, which is within reach. And Sarraj is quite correct that it's very far from ideal, but it would reduce the level, maybe end the cycle of violence. It would create conditions under which the two people could, let's hope, find ways to integrate more closely and move to a preferred solution. If there's another way, I haven't heard it. Everything else I've heard is just vacuous proposals like let's all live in peace.
Well, one last question, if I may. With regards to the extraordinary influence of Israel upon the United States and the media bias, what suggestions would you have for trying to create a more balanced picture within the U.S. or Canadian media?
There's only one method, and it's familiar, and that's education, organization, and activism. And it works. It's slow, but it works. Let's take the analogy of South Africa, which people bring up all the time. and take an actual careful look at it. There was an effective boycott sanctions movement, divestment movement against South Africa in the 1980s. Okay. Now, in more civilized countries like India, it began in 1946. So, as soon as independence was declared, Nehru declared a boycott of South Africa. But in the West, which is much under, much deeper imperial racist principles, it was hard. The first very limited boycott was in the 1960s. It was an academic boycott on a very narrow issue, namely racism in the universities. But it wasn't until many years of education and organization had taken place that the public had turned around. So by, say, 1980, there was no support for apartheid. Congress was beginning to pass legislation. Corporations were opposed to apartheid. And at that point, you could carry out the understanding of the issue had changed, not by magic, by education and activism. And it was possible to carry out a successful movement. And there's no reason why that can't happen here. So take the United States. About 2/3 of the population is in favor of the Arab peace plan. But in the United States, policy is sharply divorced from opinion. And there's a way to deal with that, namely to organize public opinion so that it's not just here's what I think, but I'm going to do something about it. Well, that's happened on issue after issue, and there's no reason why it can't happen here. Same in Canada. It's not going to happen by magic, but if people dedicate themselves to it, of course it can be done.
Well, thank you very much for your comments. I can see that I've already exceeded my time, but very appreciative, and I hope that if at some point in the future I can call you again and perhaps we can have another discussion.
Sure, like to.
Thank you very much.
Yep, bye.
Thank you.